In this lesson, we're going to take a brief look at the history of microbiology, and then we're going to talk about what microbes actually are. So what we mean by that term, and then also what organisms are going to be included in that broad group. So as we get started, if we talk about the early years of microbiology, well, first of all, we couldn't start the study of microbiology before we had the capability of viewing really tiny organisms. And so this really all started back when the first compound microscope was invented. So this was in the late 1500s. We did have the development of that first compound microscope. At that point, there were a number of scientists that did go about using that microscope to study tiny things. So observe a variety of different structures under that scope. By 1665, we had the first observations of cells. Robert Hooke is the one that did that. He was looking at dead cork cells actually, and he recognized those structures as cells, and he actually used that word cells. So that's the first use of the word cell. But again, those were dead cells that he was looking at. He didn't see any movement or anything like that when he was looking at them. Just a little while later on our timeline in 1680, Leeuwenhoek, he did observe the first living cells. So Leeuwenhoek, he had a fascination with science. He had a fascination with microscopes and studying really tiny things. He made a lot of his own very simple microscopes, which were, again, very simple. They were like really magnifying glasses that he was looking at things under. But he observed a lot of different things, and he was able to observe what he referred to as animalcules and beasties. So what he saw on his slides was things that looked like little animals to him, and he could see a lot of movement and interaction happening with them. And because of that, he did describe these as being living organisms. He was actually what we consider to be the very first microbiologist. He stimulated a lot of interest in the study of organisms under the microscope. And by the end of the 1800s, people were actually using that word microorganisms to describe really small organisms. So that's a brief history of how it all got started. And so now we're left with microbes. So if we're talking about microbes, first up, what are microbes? What do we throw into that general category right there? Well, it is really a very generic category that we're talking about when we say microbes. All this means is that these are really tiny organisms. So since they are tiny organisms, these are not things that we would be able to observe with the naked eye. In fact, we would have to have a microscope or something very similar to that that's going to enable us to see those structures that we call microbes. They do come in a lot of different types, and at this point in time, we do divide microbes into 6 basic categories. The categories of microbes are listed here. They are bacteria, we have archaea, fungi, protozoa, there's some algae, and then we also have a final category that we call small multicellular animals. So what we want to do now is we want to go through these different categories and talk about some of the general, most common features of those particular groups. First on our list are bacteria and archaea. Bacteria and archaea are definitely not the same thing, but they are similar enough that we do lump them together into a category of their own. The first thing to note about bacteria and archaea is that these are going to be made up of cells that don't have a nucleus inside of them. Because they don't have a nucleus inside of their cells, we have a special term to refer to cells like that. This is what we're going to call prokaryotic cells. So another way to say this first statement is that the bacteria and archaea are made of prokaryotic cells. Now, another thing about those two is that these cells are surrounded by a cell wall. That cell wall is going to be a very rigid structure that goes around the outside of the cell. It is made of different materials, depending on whether we're talking about the bacteria or whether we're talking about the archaea. But again, it is a very firm protective structure on the outside of the cell. These types of organisms are going to reproduce strictly asexually. Okay, so this asexual reproduction will give rise to cells that are identical, at least genetically, to the original parent cell. These are going to be really, really tiny organisms. And as far as tiny, exactly how tiny, because of course we know we're talking about microbes here, so everything's going to be tiny, but these are even tinier than the other groups that we're going to look at. To give you an idea of the scale, if you look in this picture down here, the prokaryotic cells are the little blue dots. Okay, so here's just a few if I were to go and circle those. If we were to look at a contrasting cell, ones that do have a nucleus inside of them, we have a special name for those as well, and we call them eukaryotic cells. But those, if we compare the prokaryotic with it, here I'm just outlining one of the other cells, and you can see that it's so much bigger than those little prokaryotic cells. So bacteria and archaea, they are very tiny. They also, as far as how we find them, they tend to live as either singles. What we would mean by that is as a single cell. Sometimes they live as pairs of cells, and sometimes they live as groups of cells. Those groups of cells might form colonies, or they might form filaments. We do have, as you can see here, a variety of different living styles that we would find these in. Now, bacteria, they are very prevalent organisms. We find these pretty much everywhere, all around us. They definitely live inside of our bodies as well. Many of them are harmless or even beneficial to us. And then we do have other ones that are responsible for causing a lot of different diseases. The archaea, on the other hand, tend to be found in really unusual environments. So these tend to be found in places with extreme temperatures, so like the North Pole, or we might find these in the hot springs that you might find out west. These are also found in really salty locations, so that would be a location where a lot of stuff would not be able to survive. And we also find them very, very deep in the ocean. So in the deep sea sulfur vents, we find archaea living there. Okay, so there is variety within this group for sure, and these are going to be the smallest of all of the microorganisms that we're going to discuss. Our next group is fungi. Fungi, a lot of times people look at them, if you look at a mushroom, and we think that they're kind of similar to plants, but they are a group all to themselves. Fungi are composed of cells that do contain a nucleus. Because their cells contain a nucleus, we do have a special name for those types of cells. These types of cells are going to be called eukaryotic. And those eukaryotic cells are going to have a cell wall around them. So every single one of those cells will have a cell wall made up of chitin as the specific material. It will be found outside each cell, and it's going to have a protective role that it plays. For the nutrition of fungi, or how they obtain their nutrients, they are going to get this from other organisms, and they are going to absorb it from other organisms. What fungi do is a little bit unusual because they are going to actually secrete digestive enzymes. So the enzymes that digest food come out of the fungi body or out of the fungi cells. They dissolve stuff on the outside, and then once it's dissolved, they draw it in by absorption. So we say a lot of times, or we describe their particular type of nutrition as absorptive nutrition because they are absorbing those nutrients in. Of course, that's after they dissolve things on the outside. Fungi are known to reproduce by spores. They can produce lots of spores, and those spores are going to be produced by either sexual processes or asexual processes. Spores are a very convenient way of reproducing for fungi because spores are very good at traveling long distances in water or in wind, rain, really can travel quite far. They also produce large quantities of these, so that's going to mean lots of offspring from them. And then another thing about fungi is that they can be multicellular, so made up of many cells, or they can be unicellular. Unicellular would mean that they're made up of just one cell each. In the pictures that you see here, the orange has a mold on the outside of it, and molds tend to be multicellular fungi. The unicellular ones tend to be yeast. Okay, and yeast are used for a variety of things commercially for us, such as bread baking, and then also for wine or beer production. The next group that we're going to look at is the protozoa. Protozoa are also composed of cells that do contain a nucleus. So this is another group that has eukaryotic cells. So I'm just going to put that in here for us. And the protozoa can be very similar to animals in a way. They're very similar in their nutritional needs, so how they actually eat something else, and they're also very similar in their overall cell structure. Another thing about them is that protozoa are going to be unicellular. So these are made up of just one cell each, and they are also known for their ability to move. Or in other words, these are capable of locomotion. Some of them will have a sort of tail that helps them to move. Some of them will have a type of feet or appendage that helps them to move. Some of them are moving because of the little hairs that they have on them. In any case, these really appear like tiny little animals, and there's a good chance that these particular ones are some of the ones that Leeuwenhoek was actually viewing when he talked about his beasties under the microscope. Algae is a group that's going to be very similar to plants. Algae are composed of cells that also contain a nucleus. So again, a group that is made up of eukaryotic cells. And we said they're similar to plants in their mode of nutrition and then also their cell structure. So these are going to be able to make their own food. So that's what we mean by them actually being similar to plants in nutrition. They're also going to have cell walls around them, similar to what you would find in plants. Their cell walls are made up of a unique material called cellulose. The algae are going to be unicellular, or in some cases they can be multicellular. Some of them are actually really tiny and would truly be microbes. Other ones of them are really quite giant, giant algae that you might find in the ocean. So not all algae would actually fall into the microbe category, but certainly there are a number of them that would. And algae, some of them are also capable of locomotion. So algae can have little tails on them. It's not something that you would find in all algae, but some of them do have little tails, and those tails are going to help them to actually move around. And the last group of microbes that we're going to introduce here are the small multicellular animals. So these are going to be true animals. They will have all the features of animals, but they do tend to be small. Some of them are completely microscopic. Some of them are microscopic during just certain stages of their lives. This group right here is going to include a lot of worms. Worms such as nematodes, which tend to be very microscopic, up to things like tapeworms, which is the worm that you see in the blue picture right here. Okay, so that is a quick run through of what microbes are and what groups of organisms you would actually find them in.